Thank you very much for joining me for this webinar. My name is David Solomon. As you can probably tell from my accent, or if you read the blurb beforehand, I was born in South Africa in the early 60s. I grew up there. I went to school there, and I did the mandatory military service there. While I was at school, I got very involved in Abonim, which is a very Zionist youth movement. And in 1985, I moved to Israel for two reasons, push and pull. The push was I was opposed to apartheid, which was very much the name of the game then, and we're going to be talking about this evening. And also because I was a Zionist. I am a Zionist, and I wanted to be part of, as a colleague of mine so eloquently put it, the greatest experiment in Jewish self-determination in nearly 2,000 years. I wanted to be part of it. So I did an Ulpan, and you know Hebrew when I came here, that's the subject for another webinar, but I did an Ulpan on Kibbutz Hamita up north, and then moved to Jerusalem and studied at the Hebrew University, English and history, and I did a teaching certificate, and then started teaching in an Israeli school. At the same time, I started working with American high school groups in the summer, and then I started teaching at the Hella High School, a semester program for kids from the States and Canada, in the afternoons, while teaching in Israeli school in the morning. That started in '96, and I've been working in the American in Israel educational environment since then. First with the Hella School, and then recently I joined the Alexander Mas High School, which is part of Keren Kayemet Israel. So what are we going to talk about this evening? You all know, and everybody in Israel, any Jew who cares overseas, has been traumatized by what is going on in Gaza and on the Lebanon border at the moment. And people I've spoken to from overseas are shocked at the level of protest against Israel. Some of it, they say, and I believe, but people are genuinely concerned about what Israel is doing, and some of it is a guise for anti-Semitism. I believe that one of these, and I've seen on the news, that one of the slogans that they used is that Israel is an apartheid state. Just 2 days ago, I believe it was, the South African Prime Minister, President, at a conference in the Arab Emirates, condemned Israel and pretty much compared Israel to apartheid. I will start off by saying that I absolutely reject this, and I speak as someone who opposed apartheid. Maybe we can get into what happened when I opposed apartheid in South Africa, but I will start off by saying that there's absolutely no comparison between the way Israel treats Arabs and the way people of color were treated by South Africa under apartheid. So there are a couple of different categories I want to talk about. I want to talk about Arabs who have Israeli citizenship. In other words, and this is those Arabs who were living within Israel's borders pre-67. That's one group. Another group of Arabs is those who fell under Israeli control as a result of the Six-Day War. That we'll get to a little bit later. And I'd also like to talk about the question of discrimination against various Jewish groups, because that was also a thing, is also a thing, but again, I wouldn't compare that to apartheid. So the first group I want to talk about is Arabs with Israeli citizenship. As a result of the 1948 war, many Arabs fled from what would later become Israel. Some remained. And then when the final armistice line was declared, a lot in the Jezreel Valley, up in Galilee, fell under Israeli control. They lived under martial law, Israeli military rule, until 1966. Now, yes, you could say absolutely at that stage, there was discrimination in terms of rights. In 1967, martial law ended and Israeli citizens were given full rights. Including the right to vote, the right to be members of Knesset, and we're going to see how that develops. This is very different from South Africa, where in no way, shape, or form could the rights of Black people be or colored. In South Africa, colored refers to mixed race people or Indian people, be referred to as, be seen as having anywhere near the rights of what I had as a white person. So to explain apartheid a little bit better, the actual laws, and then I'm going to show how it doesn't apply to Israel, I want to share with you a short, very short video. I'm going to share my screen with you and show you the video.
Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994. It was the official end of white minority rule, otherwise known as apartheid. Apartheid, you've heard of it, but what exactly was it? I'm Francesca Fiorentini, and this is AJ+. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means separateness. It was a system of racial segregation that governed South Africa for nearly 50 years. It specifically aimed to protect the domination of the white South Africans over non-whites in every aspect of life. But it didn't just appear out of thin air. During the colonial grab for the country between the Dutch-descended Afrikaners and the British, the rights of native Black South Africans were sidelined. So when apartheid was officially made law in 1948 by the Afrikaner-led National Party, it was a continuation of injustices already happening. Afrikaners believed that South Africa was their God-given homeland, and that the white race was superior. The Black majority was therefore seen as a threat. There were 148 apartheid laws. Blacks had to carry ID permits at all times and had to obey strict curfews. Public facilities were separated for white and non-white use, and marriages between whites and other races were banned. People were classified into 4 racial categories: white, Black, Indian, and colored, people of mixed race. And they were all separated into different residential areas. Blacks were divided into 10 so-called homelands based on tribal groups. Homelands were rural, overcrowded, and lacked jobs, forcing blacks to seek work as migrant laborers. Wages were low, and it was illegal for workers to strike. See, apartheid was also economically motivated. A cheap workforce was needed particularly to work in the country's gold mines. Powerful mining magnates had a huge stake in apartheid policies since their profits depended on keeping black wages low. Outside their designated homelands, non-whites had no political rights. Since they were not technically citizens, they couldn't vote. Education? Also divided. The state set up a separate education system for blacks that received a fraction of the funding that white schools did. Mandatory education ended at age 13 and was structured to funnel blacks into menial migrant labor. Exploitation? By design. Needless to say, there was resistance to these insane laws. Protests were often led by black students and youth and were met with severe repression. Out of these struggles came leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, who would help bring an eventual end to apartheid. So now that you know what apartheid was, could you imagine living under it? Are there any similarly unjust laws that still...
Okay, so that was the situation in South African apartheid. Let's talk about some of those laws and whether they apply in Israel. First, she spoke about curfews, where the town that I grew up in, at 9 o'clock at night, there was a siren that went off, and black people were not allowed on the streets in white neighborhoods after that time of night. The black neighborhoods were all outside of town. If you were, If you were a person of color and you were on the street after 9 p.m. after the siren, you could be arrested. 20% of the country was made up of the so-called homelands, one for each tribe. Technically, a black person had rights in their homeland. They could vote there, but they could not vote in South Africa as a whole. And as she said, those were all poor lands. There's nothing like the curfew system in Israel. There's nothing like the homeland system. Arab citizens in the pre-67 war have voting rights. Black people could only be in their tribal homeland, or if they had a work permit in a white area, they could be in the white area. If they lost their jobs, they could be deported back to the black homeland. There is nothing like that in Israel. A while ago, I had a parent say to me that she'd been told by an Arab that from the age of 16, Arabs have to carry ID documents. Yes, that's true. What she wasn't told was that Jews also have to carry ID documents. By law in Israel, if you're 16 years or older, you have to carry a government-issued ID, either an ID or a driver's license if you have. It's got nothing to do with what religion or race you are. In South Africa, by law, as I mentioned, black neighborhoods were separate from white neighborhoods. In Israel, are neighborhoods separate? Yes, to a large extent, but you have mixed towns like Jerusalem, and you have a certain level of Arabs living in Jewish towns and vice versa. There's certainly no law against this. Now, she spoke about interracial marriages not being allowed. In Israel, this is true on a certain level. This has got more to do with religious law than racial law. In Israel, a Jew can only marry a Jew. A Muslim can only marry a Muslim, and a Christian can only marry a Christian. Interreligious laws are not married because religion falls under the control of the religious authorities of the various religions. There's nothing to stop someone converting from one religion to another to get married. And certainly if a Muslim and a Jew get married outside of Israel, then that marriage is recognized in Israel. She spoke about separate education systems. This is something I saw in South Africa as a young boy. Remember, when I was growing up, until I was 13 years old, there was no television in South Africa. And even when there was, it was controlled by the government. There's one, and after a few years, 2 channels. All the news was controlled by the government. When I was 8, 9, 10 years old, 11 years old, for me, I thought that the whole world ran like whites had black housekeepers, etc., and the blacks didn't live in the white areas. For me, this is the way things were, and that's part of the tragedy as I was growing up. I saw this as absolutely normal. Fortunately, I went to a liberal school. And our school, from grades, let me give you an example, from grades 1 to 12, we had 400 students. This was a medium-sized school. Each grade was split into 2 classes. So I ended up with maybe 18 or 20 people in the class. This is a government school. I got all my books for free, all my school supplies for free. Our school, for the 400 kids, we had 2 soccer fields, 2 field hockey fields, 2 rugby fields, 4 tennis courts, a squash court, and a half Olympic-sized swimming pool, and a gym. This is for 400 kids. When I was 12, 13 years old, one of our teachers arranged, and this was illegal, but they arranged for it anyway, for us to go to a black neighborhood outside of the central white area, play soccer against the black team from the black school. And they killed us. They were much better than us, but that's not the point. What was an eye-opener for me, and this was the start of my anti-apartheid activism, was this school had 1,000 students. The average class size was over 40. They didn't have enough classrooms, so half the kids went to school in the morning and the other half in the afternoon, and then they switched. In order to teach up to 10th grade, in order to teach elementary school, you had to have a 10th grade certificate. In order to teach up to 8th grade, you had to have a high school certificate. Only after that, if they were available, did you have to have a degree in the subject that you were teaching. No books were provided by the state. There was no subsidy for school uniforms or anything like that. In terms of sports facilities, they had one soccer field with no grass on it, and no netting on the posts. Education for Black people was mandatory up to age 13. For white people, up to age 16. This meant that, as you said, they were educating people for menial labor, to work in the mines, to work in the farms, etc. Needless to say, the budget for per Black student was, I think, a fifth of what it was per white student. And that I think says it all. So in Israel, there is a budget per student, regardless of your religion or what school you go to. A school gets a certain number. Now, I know in this, I believe in the States, I'm not sure if it's like this in all states, but what I understand is that in the United States, the school gets budgeted a certain number of hours, depending on teaching hours, depending on the number of students it has. In Israel, it's a little bit different. They get budgeted the schools in the States get a certain budget, amount of money, depending on the number of students. In Israel, it's a little bit different. Here, they get budgeted a certain number of hours, depending on the number of students. So you can, obviously, more qualified people and people with more experience earn more. If your school employs somebody with a ton of experience, the government will cover those hours as long as the school's entitled to those hours. Now, you do have Jewish schools and Arab schools. But what is the reason for the difference? Purely the language of instruction. Muslim and Christian kids, for the most part, speak Arabic. They want to go to school and be taught in Arabic. Jewish kids want to be taught in Hebrew. The Israeli school that I taught at had a small number of students who were not Jewish, whose parents chose to have them educated in Hebrew for various reasons. But the bottom line is that schools get allocated a number of hours per student. Those hours, that allocation is equal between Arab students, Jewish students, it doesn't matter. The allocation is the same. Now, there's certain differences in general. If you have wealthier neighborhoods, and you do have wealthy Arab neighborhoods, if you have, like in the United States, if a school is in a wealthy area and the parents can afford to subsidize extra, well, then that school might have more than an Arab school a few miles away, or vice versa. The Arab school might have more than the Jewish school, but this is certainly not a state-based thing. She spoke, and final point I want to make about that last video is she spoke about segregated facilities. Yes, in South Africa, if I went to the bus station, the train station, the airport, or just in public, you had separate restrooms for whites and for non-whites, just like you had in the South in the 60s, etc. But the difference is here, it was state law, whereas I think I believe in the United States in the South, it was part of the Jim Crow laws. Hotels. If a hotel was in a white area, only whites were allowed to stay there. Same thing with restaurants. It's not that you had separate counters. The restaurants were either for whites or for non-whites. There is nothing like that in Israel. Even Israelis who would consider it very right-wing would be extremely puzzled if you suggested something like that. Separate transport facilities? No, nothing whatsoever. I'd like to show you another short video. This one is by a Black South African Member of Parliament, Kenneth Mashaw, and his take on the comparison between South Africa and Israel. So a short video, and then I'll be back.
There is a widespread allegation, really a slander, that Israel is an apartheid state. That notion is simply wrong. It is inaccurate and it is malicious. And it will not help to promote peace and harmony in the Middle East. Its only purpose is to demonize Israel and to isolate her in an attempt to delegitimize Israel's existence. And because it is so inaccurate, it betrays the memory of those who suffered through a real apartheid. As a Black South African who was born under apartheid in the administrative capital of South Africa, Pretoria, I know what apartheid is. I've experienced it. My parents experienced it. But having been to Israel on a number of occasions, I know that nothing is happening in that country that I've either seen or read that can be compared to apartheid in South Africa. Let's remember the major reason Nelson Mandela went to prison, why he was involved with the armed struggle. He was fighting for the right to vote, for the right to choose the leaders who believes in, for the right to move and travel freely, to live wherever one wants, to be educated, and to be admitted to the hospital or medical facility of your choice. All these things Mandela fought for because Black people never enjoyed any of them in their very own country. For example, when I had to see a white doctor who was prepared to have Black patients, I would have to go to a back room, a specially segregated room where Black patients of white doctors went. We could never enter through the same door that was used by white people. Now compare that to Israel. A few years ago, a Black pastor friend of mine went to Israel where he had an accident and had to be hospitalized. When he came back to South Africa, he said to as many people as he could that the people who are talking about apartheid in Israel are talking nonsense. When I was in that hospital in Israel, he tells people, on my right was sleeping a Jew, and on my left was a Palestinian Muslim. And in between that Palestinian Muslim and that Jew was this Black South African. In private, the Palestinians he was with in the hospital said to him, this Israel is an apartheid state thing, is what politicians are saying. It is not what we are experiencing on the ground. We all need to recognize that those who say that what is happening in Israel is like apartheid South Africa are minimizing the suffering that Black South Africans endured. They are taking the sting out of the pain that we suffered in South Africa. If South African apartheid was what people are seeing in Israel, there would never have been any need for an armed struggle. There would never have been any need for Nelson Mandela to go to prison because he would have all the rights Arabs in Israel have. There are judges in the Israel courts who are not Jewish in apartheid South Africa. You could never have had something like that. You have teachers who are not Jewish who are teaching Jewish children. These non-Jews in Israel have everything that we non-whites in apartheid South Africa never shared with white South Africans. Most South Africans know this. They know that to call Israel an apartheid state is false, that what we suffered in South Africa is not being suffered by anybody in Israel. But to those South Africans who believe these falsehoods about Israel, we say, go to Israel, go and see for yourself. Tell us where you see Palestinians having to endure what we endured during apartheid. As a member of the South African Parliament, and in the name of millions of my fellow black citizens of that country, we know what apartheid really was. And I therefore ask those in the United States, Europe, and anywhere else in the world who charge Israel with practicing apartheid to please stop doing so. You are damaging the truth. You are damaging any chance for peace in the Middle East. And most of all, you are destroying the memory of the real apartheid. The charge that Israel is an apartheid state is a lie about the real Israel, and it is a lie about the real apartheid. I am Kenneth Mishwe, a member of the South African Parliament for Prager University.
Join Prager University. Subscribe now.
Okay. So I would just want to mention, he spoke about a pastor friend of his who had been in Israel and had been in hospital. In 2 days' time, I have an appointment with an oral hygienist. She's an Arab, treating Jews and Muslims. My dentist is Jewish. My doctor is Jewish. But a few years ago, I had to have oral surgery, and my periodontal surgeon was an Arab. He showed in that video clip, you saw pictures of two judges. One of them was the judge who sentenced Ohad Olmert, the former prime minister, to jail. This is nothing like you would have seen in South Africa under apartheid. Israeli Arabs, for the most part, are content with living in Israel, and they would be fairly unhappy if they were told that they got to become part of a Palestinian state. I'm going to share another video with you. There are two, I believe, possibly three more video clips in this presentation. I will try not to. They're all short, but I think it gives a good insight. Gaia did an interview with Israeli Arabs, asking if they would like to live in a Palestinian state. These are the answers that he got.
I'm Ami Horowitz, and I've been told that Arabs living in Israel live in an apartheid state. I've come to Jaljulia, an Arab village inside of Israel, to ask them what they think.
Everyone I spoke to on camera is represented in this video.
What is life like for an Arab living in Israel?
כולנו ביחד.
הכל.
איפה שאת רוצה את יכולה ללכת?
איפה שאני רוצה, אני הולכת בכיף, בשמחה והכי יפה.
Very good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You have a good job?
Good job, yeah.
Money is good?
Money good.
יש מקום בעולם שזה 100%?
לא, זה לא 100%, קשה לחיות 100%.
אבל האנשים, האזרחים, יחד אחד לשני, הם בסדר גמור. אבל זה רק עניין של הפוליטיקאים.
אנחנו גרים במדינה שנותנת לנו הטוב ביותר. מבחינת חוקים, מבחינת הטבות, מבחינת הכל, זה הכי טוב. יחסית למדינות אחרות, זה בסדר, יחסית בסדר גמור.
לגור זה טוב, מצוין פה. עבודה טובה, חיים טובים, יש עבודה, יש פרנסה.
עושה בחיים, לומדת, עובדת, עושה חיים, ועושה טיולים, כל מיני.
כן, סבבה. אם הממשלה לא נכנסת ביניהם, הם יגיעו אחלה חיים.
יש תמיד בעיות, וגם אצל כל העולם תמיד יש בעיות. לא רק אצל פלסטינים או אצל ישראל. מישהו מחפש בעיות, יש, ומי שלא רוצה בעיות, הוא שומר. גם יש רעים אצל הערבים, לא רק אצל הישראלים. גם הורגים אחד עם השני, על השטויות.
אנחנו חיים בישראל,
רגיל, يعني, כמו כל העולם. רגיל, יש פרנסה, יש הכל, يعني, כאילו אין שום בעיה.
אין בעיה בין האנשים של היהודים והערבים, אין בעיה. אבל אני חושב, לא יודע, הממשלה, אני חושב שהיא עושה את הסכסוך ביניהם. אני עובד איתם הרבה, הכל טוב. אף פעם לא קרה לי בעיות או משהו.
על הפנים. אני נגד המדינה לא. אם אנחנו עובדים 10 שעות, המדינה לוקחת 4 שעות. אם אנחנו מקבלים תלוש של 10,000 שקל מהעבודה שלנו, הם לוקחים 4,000 שקל מה. אנחנו כמעט סוג ב' פה. מישהו אומר חוץ מזה, הוא לא מבין בפוליטיקה.
The tax rate is the same for an Israeli or for an Arab. It doesn't make a difference. But you're studying in a university here in Israel.
אני לומדת משפטים, חוקים. יש לי כל מיני. למה בחגים של היהודים כולם חובה לשבת, בחגים של הערבים לא? אתה יכול להגיד לי? אני סטודנטית באוניברסיטה. למה בחגים של יהודים יושבים, בחגים של הערבים עובדים, לומדים רגיל?
But America doesn't celebrate Jewish holidays as national holidays either.
כל המדינה זה שלנו, שטחים, ופה זה נקראת פלסטין.
Would you prefer to be a citizen of Palestine or a citizen of Israel?
אני מעדיף להישאר פה, כי אני נולדתי גם בישראל. פלסטין, אין לי משהו שם. יש לי הכל, בית, משפחה, גם קלנסווה, הכל פה בישראל.
Would you prefer this town to be part of Palestine, or would you prefer this town to stay in Israel?
אני תחת פה, נשאר פה. אני איפה שנולדתי, אני נשאר פה, ואני ימות פה גם.
עם הרשות הפלסטינאית, לעשות הסכם שלום ולתת את האדמות האלה לרשות הפלסטינאית.
על הבית.
את מעדיפה?
זה לא שאני מעדיפה. קודם כל פלסטין זה האדמה שלנו. זה דבר ראשון של סבתא או של סבא והאלו. אבל אני מבחינת כאילו, אני רוצה להישאר עם אותו חכים, אבל במדינה של פלסטין. זה לא הולך ביחד, אבל זה...
מה אתה מעדיף?
פה. נתן בישראל. לנו יש קצת יותר זכויות, קצת דמוקרטיה, להם אין הרבה זכויות ואין להם הרבה דמוקרטיה.
לא, אני לא אבוא לפלסטין.
אזרחות ישראלית בוודאות.
Do you feel like an Israeli?
אתה מרגיש כמו שאתה ישראלי?
לא, ישראלי בטוח.
Do you think that life for an Arab in Israel is better than life for Arabs in most of the Arab world?
כן, לגור במדינה דמוקרטית זה לא כמו לגור במדינה דיקטטורית.
מה שאני רואה, כן, זה מבחינתי. מה שאני רואה, כן. זה מדינה דמוקרטית, וגם יש חברי כנסת ערבים שם, והכל. בשבת, כל מיני באים אלינו. אוכלים ביחד, שותים ביחד, עובדים ביחד, מתקשרים ביחד.
Jews and Arabs.
יהודים וערבים. בקלנסווה, איפה שאני גר. בסדר גמור. אני עובד עם יהודים. וכל השמה שיש לי בחיים זה פה, בישראל.
It's very revealing that, because I genuinely believe that most of the Arab population does feel that way. I want to tell you one more little story, and then I'll tell you about the not so nice side of life for Israeli Arabs. I'm speaking to you from Givat Yaariv, which is a moshav west of Jerusalem, sort of overlooking the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway. Down below me is the village of the town of Abu Ghosh, an Arab village. There's a woman there who regularly used to speak to our students, Yasmin. She is a British woman who converted to Islam and married a Muslim. He's a tour guide working in Israel, and they live down below in Abu Ghosh. She is a very religious, very devout Muslim woman. And when she talks to our kids, she tells them that as a Muslim woman, she has more rights in Israel than she would in any Arab country. I think that says a lot. But I also think to a certain extent it's misleading. I've been speaking about how what we have here really isn't a problem, and it isn't. But I don't want you to go away with the impression that everything is hunky-dory. It's not. In Israel, politics is sectarian. You've got the religious groups of various factions. You've got left-wing, like the Tel Aviv type. You've got settlers. You've got, you name it. And you join a government, if you support a party, your party joins a government, they get money for its interests. Unfortunately, the previous government was the first time that an Arab party had been part of the government. That means that the Arab voice shouting for resources, for that little bit extra was lost. So there is a bit of a gap. Not like if any of you have been to South Africa and you've seen the townships with the shacks, and even now with so-called low-cost high housing, you can't compare it to the white neighborhoods. So yes, there is some discrimination, and there is tension within Arab society itself. The murder rate within Arab society in Israel is horrific, and it's out of all proportion to the murder rate in the society as a whole. And these murders have nothing to do with politics. This has nothing to do with the Arab-Israel conflict. It's gangs, and it's also, I'm sad to say, honor killings, where women are murdered by their own family members for allegedly bringing dishonor to the family. But that is subject for a different discussion. I've been speaking up to now about Israeli, those people within the pre-67 borders. But we need to talk about those who were born outside of those borders, depending on your political point of view. The West Bank, Judea and Samaria, the occupied territories, whatever you want to call it, is fine for the purpose of this discussion. The point is it's outside of the 67 borders. With the exception of the Arabs of East Jerusalem who were offered Israeli citizenship when East Jerusalem was annexed to Israel, and the same thing in the Golan Heights for the Druze. Most of the Druze there and most of the Arabs rejected, declined to take Israeli citizenship. All the other Arabs in Judea and Samaria, and of course those in Gaza, were not offered Israeli citizenship. And by international law, when a country conquers, liberates, however you want to look at it, a territory and takes control over another people, not its own, it is not, by international law, it's not allowed to force citizenship on that people. So the West Bank, Judea and Samaria Arabs do not have the right to vote for the Knesset. Israeli Arabs do. There are 12 Arab members of Knesset. They do not have the freedom of movement that Israeli Arabs do. Now, this depends on the security situation. Sometimes, if they have a work permit, they can come into Israel proper, into the pre-67 borders. If they don't have a work permit, they are not allowed to. When the Oslo Treaty was going well, you had massive numbers of people entering into Israel to work, etc., and everything was fine. And then the bus bombing started, and the bombings in West. And access to Israel was limited. All of a sudden, within Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, you have roadblocks being put up, which limit people's movements. People can still move, but they check at these points. Sometimes it's slow, and sometimes it's tedious. And the checks at points for the entering Israel, for those who could had permission to come in, and that number was reduced. Took forever. Life became harder. Nobody can say that the life of your average Palestinian living in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank is at the level of your average Israeli. It just isn't. Now, the question that this begs, and this is too big of a discussion for now, but the question that this begs is, okay, who's responsible for that? Whose fault is that? On a personal note, during the bombings of 2002, 2002, I lost 2 of my students. When I see that, when I was driving along, I have a car, I wasn't taking buses. If I stopped at a light and a bus stopped next to me, I got really nervous. For me, when I saw that wall going up, for me that was just a killer. Whether this has to be permanent or not is a different story. In my mind, the drop in lifestyle, in standard of living for Palestinians living on the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is as much their fault as anyone else's. It's a sad reality of the world that we live in. Now, that said, couple of years ago, Rabbi Jaffe, who was the chief rabbi of the Reform Movement, spoke to our students, and he made the following point. He's referring to the immigration many years ago of Ethiopian Jews, when Israel brought 30,000 Jews from Ethiopia. And he said that if Israel hadn't existed, American Jews could have knocked on the doors of Congress all they wanted, and the same thing in other countries, Britain, the so-called liberal democracies. Those countries would not have accepted the Ethiopian Jews the same way that they didn't accept the Jews in 1958. Can American Jews influence things? Yes, they can. American Jews have, but Israeli Jews have. We organized an airlift, we bribed whoever needed to be bribed, and in the space of 4 days, we airlifted 30,000 Jews to Israel. Why am I mentioning this? My personal belief is that with power, the flip side of power is responsibility. We have control over the Palestinians, definitely in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and also in Israel proper. The flip side of power is responsibility. There are inequalities. There are inequalities in employment, sometimes, in some professions. Often in Israeli newspapers or for waiters, you'll see a sign advertising a job. It's for people who've served in the army. That's the code word for only Jews or Druze or Bedouin who have served. Now, an increasing number of Muslims are serving in the army as well, so they would be accepted. But there is subtle discrimination. The same way there is subtle and sometimes not so subtle discrimination in the United States. I was a white person in an apartheid country. It's my belief that when you rule over other people, if you don't do it wisely and with compassion, it eats away at you. That you pay a price as well. And I don't want Israel to pay that price. I definitely think we need to watch out for for lashing out in response to bombings, etc., etc. On the whole, though, I think we have done pretty well. So I have one more clip I want to show you. This is a clip, it's from a few years ago. It's by Alan Dershowitz. Now, I know he's become a bit of a controversial figure, but this is, let's put it this way, this was before he became controversial. So I'm going to share this with you, and then we'll get together for some other aspects of Israel and apartheid state that you might not have thought of.
Whenever I speak to audiences about the Middle East, sometimes audiences very hostile to Israel, I issue one challenge. Name a single country in the history of the world faced with threats comparable to those threats faced by Israel that has ever had a better record of human rights, a better record of concern for civilians, a better record of sensitivity toward legal issues and the rule of law. In 100 speeches in which I've issued that challenge, no one has ever come up with the name of a country that has a better record than Israel faced with comparable threats. Now, if that's true, how come there have been more resolutions condemning Israel at the United Nations, at the human rights councils, at various human rights organizations? Why have there been more resolutions directed against the best country than the worst countries? That doesn't reflect on Israel. That reflects on the sorry nature of human rights in the world today. Rene Cassin, Eleanor Roosevelt, the people who formulated human rights are turning over in their grave by the way in which the human rights agenda has been hijacked by some of the worst human rights offenders to exculpate and prevent themselves from being prosecuted by turning false attention to Israel. If only the rest of the world has as good a human rights record as Israel has had since its creation over the last 63 years, we would be a much more peaceful world. We would have less need for aggressive human rights organizations. In 1940s, we said never again. And the tragedy is what we've seen instead all over the world has been again and again and again. In Darfur, in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in the former Yugoslavia, again and again and again. And what has the world done? It's condemned Israel. Consider 1975. Cambodia was murdering between 2 and 3 million innocent people. What was the UN debating? Zionism is a form of racism. There wasn't a single resolution in the UN regarding Cambodia during the genocides. The same thing was true in the 1990s. The same thing was true in the first decade of the 21st century. So when we celebrate human rights, we have to look at all the human wrongs in the world, because human rights should be a reaction to human wrongs. And what we've seen instead is that the human rights agenda has been hijacked by those who perpetuate human wrongs. And the victims, the real victims, have not been Israel. Israel can deal with its problems and defend itself. The real victims have been the 6 million people who have been killed since we said never again in preventable genocides, because human rights, which should be directed against those kinds of genocides, instead is always focused on the one nation that has the best human rights record in the world when faced with comparable threats. Israelis ought to be proud of their record. They ought to improve it. Nobody's perfect. Nobody has a perfect human rights record. But all human rights have to be viewed comparatively. And so as we look to human rights and celebrate them, I think one has to look to Israel as a model and has to look at the United Nations and other organizations as a model of what not to do, how not to respond to the problems of the world today.
Okay, that was the last video. As he said, there is room for improvement. And I'd like to point out, in the interest of being totally transparent, that there is prejudice in Israel against Arabs. There is prejudice against, Druze, Bedouins. But there's prejudice all over the world. This is not an excuse. I'm just stating a fact. There's also, by the way, prejudice within the Jewish Israeli community. It's much less now, but there used to be a lot of prejudice against Jews of Sephardic origin. This was part of what led in the 1970s to the rise of the Likud and Menachem Begin. Although he was a Polish Jew, he knew about the feelings of the Sephardic Jews, and he catered to their needs. Ironically enough, the great equalizer between Sephardim and Ashkenazim has been the Israeli army. The people served together were Nobody, when you're in the army, nobody knows what type of home you're living in, whether it's a small shack or a 5-bedroom mansion. There's no fashion. Everyone's wearing the same uniform. And the IDF played a major role in breaking down prejudices against Sephardic Jews. There are still some. The Shas party makes its Sephardic roots and heritage and looking after Sephardic interests a key point of its platform. I mentioned Ethiopian Jewry earlier. There is a lot of discrimination against them until a few years ago. Any Ethiopian who came to donate blood, the blood was taken, etc., but it was disposed of without being checked, automatically, because of a fear of AIDS. Everybody else's blood was checked. No. The difference is in Israel and South Africa is that this was made public and there was a major outcry because of it, and that policy was changed. As of many other discriminatory practices, people do discriminate here, but when they're found to do so, they cut the shame. That was not the case in apartheid South Africa. It might be now, but it certainly wasn't there. As I said, we have a way to go. We are not perfect. We need to use our power wisely. But I think that we can feel safe in believing and asserting to others that Israel is not an apartheid state.